there is this belief that in their world, for example, I as a human being also exist, but in a different form myself, because it's a form that allows them to have their full potentiality, not constrained. And so my full access to everything, they have their full access in their world. And I'm the one that's limited because I don't have the same physicality, the same vibrational fullness. I don't have all my faculties to me. I don't have the fullness of what I am inside of their world. And that's why plant communication to me is so powerful, because it goes beyond words. That even scientifically speaking, there is a whole grouping of people that are saying, how can you deny consciousness to plants?
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Shifting Dimensions podcast. I'm your host, Jumi Moses, and this is a podcast where we explore the unseen, the unknown, and the transformative moments that shift our understanding of reality. I'm a spiritual seeker and metaphysical investigator exploring the mysteries of existence, and thank you for joining me. On the show today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Tigrilla Gardenia. She is a nature-inspired mentor, certified life coach, and world ambassador for plant advocacy. She empowers creative multi-potentialites and nature-inspired professionals to live authentically and purposefully in collaboration with the plant world. Drawing from plant neurobiology, ecosystem thinking, and esoteric teachings, she helps individuals transform limiting beliefs and embrace their many passions. She's also the host of the podcast called Reconnect with Plant Wisdom, where she explores the profound ways plants guide us toward a more conscious life. Tigria, thank you so much for being here today. It's such a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I was listening to the bio and I was like, wow, who's she talking about? It's like you almost don't remember the things that you've done. And when you hear them, you're like, oh, wow, that's me.
Yeah, you've been doing some really cool stuff. And I was telling you before we hit record that I'm so fascinated by the plant world. I love plants. I like when I walk past plants and trees, there's just this peace and calm I feel around them. And I can almost kind of sense their vibration, probably nowhere as deep as you sense their vibration. So I'm really excited to kind of dive into the plant world because there's so many dimensions to our world. And I think some of the things that we come across every day, we take for granted, right? When we walk past and see a beautiful field of flowers, we take that for granted and we don't realize like there's a whole world, there's a whole vibration, there's a whole frequency, whole system that is going on there and that's yet to be explored or acknowledged. And you doing the work that you do, you acknowledge that, right? So I want to start off with asking you, how did you get into this work, right? What does it mean to be a nature inspired mentor?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I won't go into my full background because my background is very weird in a good way. I always say I'm weird and woo, and that's me. And so I have a very varied background that starts from music engineering and working at big companies like Microsoft, and then coming into the performing arts again. So my background has always kind of come into this artistic and technological perspective, and then also by being an initiate of multiple mystery schools and different initiatic paths, it's always had this esoteric kind of thread that courses through them. To pick up a point in time to start and answer your question is that I live in what's considered one of the largest spiritual eco communities in the world. It's called Damanhur. It's in northern Italy. We've built, these beautiful underground temples that are kind of considered the eighth wonder of the world or the first wonder of the new world. And here I was in Damanhur. I've been living here for almost 15 years now. And one day I was walking and I heard this beautiful music. And this music, being a musician, being somebody who really loves music, but it was strange music. I was like, I don't know this type of music. So I followed the source and ended up at a device. And it was like this little box. And I was like, okay. So I followed the cables and it was connected to a plant. And this was my first foray into the music of the plants. And I kept staring at this like plant and listening to, this music. And it was almost as if I could understand what the plant was trying to say. Like many of us, music is one of those things, one of those languages that really speaks to me, that I can understand that when you hear a song, you can feel the intention of the songwriter, the singer, all these different things. And it was exactly the same expect that was happening with the plant. And that was it. That was where my plant reawakening really began. So from there, it just all sort of kept tumbling because it was this awakening and understanding that there's more, that plants aren't objects. Plants aren't just base living, but that there is a consciousness, there is an awareness, there's an understanding, all these things to it. And then Damanhur really moves synchronicity. It's like every time you think, oh, okay, I figured it out, and you just walk off, it's no, I don't think so. And so this synchronic flow ended up happening where I got asked to work on a project connected to the music of the plants. That got me into the scientific perspective and really diving deeper into that. I had the music perspective, and then, all these different pieces that kind of led me to where I am today.
When I was reading your bio, right, and seeing that you had like a music background and an engineering background, and you've kind of really been in the tech world, but then looking at what you do with the plants, it's just a perfect synergy between your left and right brain.
Yeah, it's one of those rare, like, I didn't notice that until I was older. But at some point, somebody looked at me, and I've had it, I have to admit, I've had people who look at me and they're like, oh my goodness, your right brain and your left brain are activated. I was like, yeah, don't ask me how. I don't know. But it is true. Like, there's a part of me that is extremely logical and I love structure. And then there's this other part of me that's very, let me rephrase, let me try to find the right word, because for many years I was afraid to use the word creative because in my world, how I grew up, the creatives were the people on the stages. And I was the backstage person. And it wasn't until I found this quote back when I was working in tech, because I started my tech career in music software, like, the whole streaming music. I was on the frontier of that world, super privileged, and on the beginning of video that was just coming online. And I had this quote, which unfortunately I don't remember it exactly, but it's kind of along the lines of, those of us that enable the magic on stage to happen are also artists. And it was the first time that I realized that, oh my goodness, even though I had this degree that had music in it, and I have a degree from a school of music, and I do play instruments, but because that's not my the part that I express the most, I express more other parts. I had never understood that I actually was flowing between both of them. And it was really interesting when it was one of the many things that the plants helped me understand, that creativity and that expression. I was a dancer, I have sung, I have played instruments. I mean, I'm just not great at any of them. And I thought that was a negative point. And the plants helped me understand that in reality, all of that is super useful because the way that I weave them together is the thing that makes me who I am. And it's where my strength is not in any one of them. My strength is in the way that they all come together on a regular basis. And that was something that if it wasn't for the plants, I don't think I would have gotten there in the way that was, quote unquote, for lack of a better term, natural.
Honestly, I think that is really the dream to be able to exercise both parts of our brains. And for the listeners who are listening, the left brain is more like structured, analytical, data driven, whereas the right brain is more of our creative side, our intuitive side, the stuff that's not the left brain, essentially. But the goal is to not hyper focus on just one part of our brain function. And we use both sides all the time, but I
Of
think
course.
we are socialized in the society to prioritize and celebrate our left brain function over our right brain function. And a lot of times we want to make sure that there's a synergy between both of them. So it's just fascinating. And I love talking to people who, really are able to kind of bridge that gap and really go back and flow through each side of the brain hemisphere seamlessly. But, you've talked about the fact that the plants helped you realize this. You've talked about plant music, and I want to acknowledge what you're saying here, right? You're essentially talking about plant communication, plant consciousness. And I want to talk about the plant music piece, but I'm going to push that aside a little bit for now. And let's kind of go back, right?
Right.
What do you mean that the plants helped you realize this? Is there consciousness there? Are you talking to them?
All right, so here I'm going to wear multiple hats and I'll play around and I'll tell you which hat I'm wearing at the time. So, from a scientific perspective, there is, as I like to say it, I said this, it's the clip that Gaia ended up picking out when they used my little snippet for the trailer of the episode of Divine Science that I'm in. There's a raging debate happening right now in the scientific world around the idea of consciousness. Mind you, this debate started in BC, like before in about 700 BC between Plato and Aristotle. So it's not a new debate, but unfortunately it keeps going, which is debate on to what level of awareness do plants have? Let's just use the word awareness so that we don't, get anybody angry. And it's this really interesting conversation of what does consciousness even mean? I mean, from even a human perspective, science will say we're conscious, but they don't actually cannot really define what that means other than self-aware. The fact that I know that I am myself, I can differentiate myself from someone else, I am aware of what's happening around me, and I have a running thought process. The problem with plants is that because we don't necessarily understand their language, and scientifically speaking, we can't kind of get into they don't have a mind, they don't have a brain, then that argues as to, well, are they having conscious thoughts at all? So just setting that up for a second, which means that there are, those of us that really just inherently believe it because in our own experience, we have quote unquote heard plants. And that comes in many different ways, which I'll get to in one second. But science struggles because they want to have proof. And there are those that say that consciousness only exists in the brain. Like with no brain, there is no such thing. So therefore, animals that have brains can be conscious. And then there's this other kind of like panpsychism that says everything is conscious. So therefore, this is a moot conversation. It's funny, I do this plant consciousness commentary on Fridays on YouTube. And I just have finished, like by the time we're recording this, I have just finished going through over 20 papers that are dedicated to this topic. So I have a lot of period of experience now understanding this. And it is a debate from a scientific perspective. But there's a lot that will say that the only reason it's still a debate is because we're trying to use human physiology and animal physiology to understand something that's happening in a species that is completely different from animals. And here is where the more artistic as well as esoteric or spiritual side comes in, because plant communication is not and probably will never be what you and I are doing right now in the sense of those words spilling out. As a matter of fact, there is a belief system that really plants like language is actually a musicality. It's musicality that is older. It is rhythm. It is tonality. There's many different aspects of which through the electromagnetic signals of the plants, you do see this. You do see rhythm. You do see awareness. We know plants can sense. They have not only the five senses we do, something that I think is starting to become finally wide known, that plants can hear and plants can see in their own ways, and plants can actually taste and touch and all these different perspectives, but they also have 15 other senses beyond the senses that we as humans have, or I believe the senses that we as humans have conditioned ourselves to turn off, but I really believe that we have them. We know plants are aware. We know that they react to their environment. We know that they are listening in, quote unquote, using multiple senses, and that they are aware and not just reacting, but also being preemptive. In other words, they know when something is going to happen, like when the season is going to change, when the sun is going to come up, where it's going to come up, and they make decisions based on this. All this to say that even scientifically speaking, there is a whole grouping of people that are saying, how can you deny consciousness to plants? Look here. And therefore, we as people who do not have to only rely on science because we have our spiritual perspectives and our artistic perspectives, we can start to tap into other parts of the plants. And this is where I love like this bridge between the three pieces, because the artistic world, who is not defined by rules of any sort, can tap into that flow that the spiritual side already knows exists and can develop, design, express what the plant can express directly to many people. And this is to me what really indicates the consciousness of plants. It isn't just what gets measured, although in my opinion, there's plenty that is getting measured. It's not just the spiritual person that says, I feel it, which is totally valid, and I love it. Like I can feel it in my body. I can feel it through thoughts. I can feel it in memories. I feel it in dreams. There are so many ways that plants are reaching out to us and sharing the wisdom and the knowledge and the experiences that they have. And then there is the artist that takes this all in and then expresses it. It's almost as if they become the quote unquote mouthpiece for the plant. They do it in poetry. And when I say they, I mean all of us, because the truth of the matter is that we're all artists in this realm. And that's why plant communication to me is so powerful because it goes beyond words. It helps us get back in touch with our bodies, back in touch with other parts of ourselves, with our subtle bodies, our auric layers, in order to then express things without having to use the mouth. I remember, like, over my whole journey, I have an episode of my podcast, I think it's episode 98, which is all about receiving plant communication. And I talk about how, because I'm clairaudient, listening, hearing words, phrases was like the first signal, especially with the music, which to me was like, I mean, I still use plant music a lot in order to be able to hear what the plant wants me to understand. But then, if you're in the video and you can see this little plant right behind me, this one here, when I started working, said, I'm not going to talk to you. I'm not even going to give you a name. I'm not going to give you anything. You need to get back in touch with your body. You are a dancer. You're expressive. You've always talked with your arms and your body, and you've always felt things. And where the hell did all of that go? Where did that science logical mind take over? And this plant made me move, said, I'm only going to share with you things that make your body move. And that's how you're going to know what I'm saying. And it opened up a whole different dimension of me. Like now I hear not just plants, but like my intuition has come back because I feel it in my body. And it's like a sense of myself that I had shut down that I opened up. So kind of wrapping all that back up is that plant communication really is all the ways that plants express volatile organic compounds, scents and smells like we have, electromagnetic signals, but then all the things that even in scientific realms are being called telepathy just because we don't know what sense the plant is using to send it. And these are scientific experiments. We don't know what sense the plant is using to send, and we don't have any idea what the human is doing to receive, but we know that there's receiving happening and sending happening. And so they just chalk that up to telepathy kind of thing. So all of that is like to say, if plants are doing all these things, of course they're conscious. They have to be aware, and they can know who they themselves are in order to be able to share with you who you are.
Thank you for that thorough breakdown. I absolutely love that. There are a couple of things here that I want to quickly touch on, right? First of all, I think the conversation in question about consciousness and whether or not it's housed in the brain. Of course, I know that there's a whole argument for that, but then there's also a whole argument that says it's not really housed in the body, right? Which again, you can see through interacting with things like not things, they're not things, I don't want to call plants things, but interacting which you can see through
I use
interacting with
beings.
plants,
That's the word I
beings.
use,
Yeah,
beings.
yeah. Perfect. Which you can see by interacting with plants, right? And other non-human or non-animal type
Yep.
beings. So what's interesting about what you talked about, and I love that you brought up telepathy, because I guess we're getting to this point in our consciousness, not just like people who are spiritual or artistic, but people in the science community are trying to figure out like, hey, what's going on here? Where it seems like people can, talk to each other without opening their mouth, and
Right.
they're trying to test that. But it's interesting because I think as human beings, when we think about communication, the first thought is like, is the plant opening its mouth to talk to you? And what does that mean? So it's kind of like these things require you having a blank slate of thought and not really putting yourself in a box so that you can properly run experiments or try to figure out what's going on from a scientific perspective. But I also love that you said that we have science on one end, we have spiritual people on one hand and who have this innate knowing and feeling that plants are conscious. And then you have the artists that kind of bridge the gap between both of
Right.
those things, right? Creating music, poetry, etc. So I thought that was very fascinating. But I kind of want to dig deeper a little bit into your world. I know that you said that you're clairaudient, right? So you are able to telepathically or, receive messages and words from plants. Let us into your world for a second, right? For the listeners who are listening, right?
Yeah.
What does that feel like? How can you validate that you're talking to the plants?
Yeah, that's a great set of questions because so it took me a long time to even kind of acknowledge the fact that I was clairaudient in general, which was something that ended up being an aha moment because it sort of validated the running conversation in my head that the running conversation wasn't always coming from me. I was like, oh, that's why it sounds so unfamiliar. It's not always me. And so that helped me understand it. So like we said, plant music in general was the first foray into that type of expression with plants because again hearing the music, letting the music come in into a here, I could almost hear the other conversation happening through the melodies and the through the different notes of music. I could hear it in a new way, and that led to transferring it into words or understandings that then started to work through that perspective. So for me, accepting that I was clairaudient, and you asked the question of, well, how do you know that it's actually you? So, a few different things. One, I had, luckily, by the time that this happened, I had a spiritual path that I had been working on for a long time. I had been a part of different initiatic schools. I had been, a teacher. I taught Kabbalah and sacred geometry. So, I had been building up my trust, my self trust, my intuitive trust, my relationship with my higher self, my relationship with other layers of myself, my relationship with other beings at other levels. It was something that it was a slow building of trust over time. So that helped for sure. And then I have always worked in and living in community has added to that so much more, which is the importance of having a solo practice in relation to others. One of the people I just spoke to for my own podcast, we were talking about, and I think we named the podcast episode Solo Together, because this is something that plants show us so well. They are independent, interrelated beings. Always. You can never take a plant out of the context because in order to survive, you need soil, and soil has other beings, and you need air, which air has all these other things. So a plant always sees themselves as an ecosystem with an ecosystem. The truth is that we as humans are also the same thing. I mean, human cells in our body is only about 10, 15%. The rest of it is all microbes and everything else. So we are also always solo together. We always are these interrelated beings. So in reality, we're wired to hear beyond ourselves. We are wired to have multiple kinds of relationships, to have, love relationships and family relationships and relationships where maybe I don't care what you're doing, but you care what I'm doing, and vice versa. To have relationships where we hurt each other, to have relationships where we help each other. We are actually wired for a large number of relationships that we do see in the natural world, but that we as humans have forgotten. We've labeled them negative. We've done all these types of things. So when we step back into these relationships, which is why, for example, in my own work, I work one-on-one with people and in group, because having both of these allows me to have my own process and test out my own feelings, beliefs, thinking, how do I do this, whatever, and then have the mirrors of those around me who share experiences. And that helps me better understand, oh, this person said something. Did that validate what I was experiencing myself? Did it instead challenge it? Did it trigger me because there's maybe something I still don't get? Did they say something that I hadn't thought about, but that when I put that into my own context, all of a sudden makes it easier for me to understand myself? I really fundamentally believe that every spiritual practice in particular, but any practice, always needs the mixture of the component between I am an individual and I have my individual experience and I work, maybe even one-on-one or just in my own meditation sphere, breath work, this, that, and the other, so that I get to know my body's reaction. And then I have to quickly test it out in a safe space. I have to have that grouping, that community around me that allows me to put what I experienced for myself into a context with others, whether that be physical others or other kind of others, like other kin, as you were saying. And then what comes back to me? How do I feel about it? What is that experience? And that has been what has helped me with my plant communication. I founded an online platform, an online community called the Naturally Conscious Community, where we have lots of different programs in different spaces, a book club and writing and creativity group and, classes, as well as master classes and discussions, meditations, all these different avenues that allow us to then test out and get feedback on what is happening, and also just even say things that I believe and having reactions, and how does that reaction land in my body? How does it feel on myself? So that's really, I think, where we just, I mean, from a natural perspective, we evolve faster together. That every species in the world evolves faster together. And so I feel like this is a really important aspect, and it is what has allowed me to evolve my plant communication beyond just that clairaudient side, but to now be embodied, to work on it for the subtle body of imagination, which is one of the things that I worked on, to work on it for a particular like task, to work on it on a multidimensional level, with the plant world as an overall world or a kin home. So it's what has allowed me to have my solo practice with the plants that I work with, as well as accelerate it because I have all these different mirrors that help challenge, move, grow, expand, confirm, support, all of those pieces.
Beautiful. And I can just see you lighting up as you talk about all of this. I can just tell how passionate you are about it. Not just how passionate you are about it, but like how real your experiences are. And, I think, as we mentioned earlier, I don't know if I mentioned this while recording, but I can kind of sense the vibration a little bit sometimes from plants or trees, very minimally, but I can feel their grandness, if that makes any sense.
Perfect sense.
So, speaking about frequency and feeling their grandness, I want to go back to the plant music piece a little bit, right?
Yeah.
I just want to make sure I fully understand. So basically, when you first heard plant music, you were hearing something and then you found a box, a machine that had wires, and you traced those wires and you realized, oh my gosh, it's hooked up to these plants. So how is plant music created?
Yeah. So the music of the plants is the device that Dom and her started to work on in the late 1970s. It was an experiment that was connected to the idea of, I wonder if I can hear what a plant is thinking. That was really the original thought. The original thought was, because back then we didn't know very much. I mean, the science wasn't out. I mean, you had the book like The Secret Lives of Plants that came out in the late 1960s, early 1970s, but we didn't have a lot of information. And Dom and her's philosophy is very much connected to what we call the reunification of the mother worlds, the idea that the human plant world, the human animal world, the plant world, and the world of nature spirits was once combined, and that has been separated out, and that's caused many of our issues with separation and things like that. And so it's a big element of our work here to reunify these three worlds through bridge species and many other kinds of activities that we take on and missions that we carry out for humanity. So in the late 1970s, they wanted to try to start to understand plants better, because if we're going to reunite our worlds. And so the music of the plants started off as this experiment. We know that we as human beings have an electromagnetic system, signals, excuse me. Our neurons fire electronically. There's all kinds of different electrical systems that are going through our bodies. And that's how our nervous system to a certain extent works. Plants also have an electrophysiology that also moves through these potentials, what's called action potentials and variant potentials, moves electricity through their body. So we thought, oh, what if we connect into that? Since that's connected to our central nervous system as humans, and we think about, see what we hear. And our thought was, like I said, just let's just hear what the plants are experiencing. So we created a first device, and over the years, we started to perfect this device. But what we noticed was that when we were listening, so this device has the basic physiology has always been the same. It's a biofeedback device. It allows us to connect from the leaves to the root system of the plants and to listen to the electrical impedance or the difference in potential between these two locations. And what we started to hear was that the more the plants played, the more the plants would react. They would react to musicians that would play and they would like copy notes and signals. And we started to realize through artistic means that in reality, plants were listening and reacting, responding to what was happening. So from the 1970s to where we are today, we have this, beautiful small device called the Music of the Plants, which there's several models. The most common is called the bamboo, and it's a portable device that allows you. So it really just takes that electrical impedance, that resistance, that difference between these 2 points, and it brings it into the device. The device has an algorithm that translates that into notes of music, and then using MIDI, it plays it out. So that's really what the device does. The device is, I call it, to make it easier, a musical instrument for plants, because it's just like I have a guitar and I have to learn what the notes are by putting my fingers on them, or a piano, I have to know what each key means. The plants have to learn, okay, for me, this electrical signal means this note. And so over time, they get to learn how it is that their electrical signals affect the music and then can create more conscious music.
Incredibly fascinating. I'm gonna look up on YouTube after our call, plant music. I
Yes.
I I hope I can find that online because
Oh,
I
you
now
you
I
just
want to
just
hear.
music of the plants, or go even to my website, tigrillagardenia.com
Mhm.
slash music of the plants, all one word, and you'll find it, and, on all the social media and stuff like that.
Beautiful, beautiful. Can't wait to check it out. Okay, so you said something interesting because now I want to kind of journey into the plant world a little bit more and talk about their wisdom and all that stuff. So you said something interesting where you said that, th there was a time where there was this belief that our world and their world, there was a connection there. And now we're trying to find our way back to that connection since we've been separated. What is the story behind the separation? And two, if someone's thinking about this, they were like, how are we separate from the plant world? I mean, I walk down the street and I see a bunch of plants. How are we separated? So what is the connection? What does the connection look like? And why are we saying that we're separated now? I hope that was a whole bunch of questions.
Yeah, no, it's super clear. So you have to think that we as human beings and as animals, especially the bird species, have a divine spark, right? We have this part of ourselves. Now, everybody has a different philosophy around this. So I'm going to try to give the most, to a certain extent, generic version of the philosophy, just to see, we all have this divine spark, this part of ourselves that is what reminds us that we are divine beings. It's what connects us from a Damanhurian philosophy. It's what connects us to the primeval divinity, which is like the source. What we think of as source is probably the equivalent of the primeval divinity. It's just different terms for the same thing. So this little shard of this divine spark is something that we carry inside of ourselves. And at one point, we all sort of carried that same spark. We were all connected to this that is the same. And at some point, we don't really know why. We know we have lots of philosophies, like lots of theories, let me just say it this way, whether it was on purpose or it was something that happened by accident, whether it was connected to, the forces that are trying to hold humanity back from its evolution or hold the planet back from its evolution. But at some point, there was a separation that caused it, that what we see today, and I'm looking out, there's Gary the silver fir outside, and there's, Jaina and Zan, which are two aloes that live right in front of where I'm sitting right now. And when I look at them, what I see is, permit me for saying it this way, is the human representation of a plant. In other words, this is a being with their own divine spark, with their own fullness of life and of the physical as well as a subtle world. But they have taken on a shape and a form and a mode of existence that allows me in my human animal world to experience them, to connect to, but there's still that separation, right? That separation that's not just because you're a different species, but because there's something about you that I still can't completely come into, as if and which is different than the way you and I chat, right? Because we're all in the same and or the same way I interact with an animal, right? My cat, my dog, like I interact in a way that feels much more familiar, much more comfortable because we're all part of that same world. The plants have found this form in order for them to be in our world. In other words, physical, non-vibrational world, let's use that term, the right frequency. So I can still see them, interact with kin, but there's something that still keeps me separate. And that is the separation between our worlds. There is this belief that in their world, for example, I as a human being also exist, but in a different form myself, because it's a form that allows them to have their full potentiality, not constrained, and so my full access to everything, they have their full access in their world. And I'm the one that's limited because I don't have the same physicality, the same vibrational fullness. I don't have all my faculties to me. I don't have the fullness of what I am inside of their world. I barely have it where I am right now because we've turned ourselves off with so much conditioning. But, at least I have access to it. Over there, I don't. So, the belief system, and this is something that's been interesting going back to the whole community thing. I take people into the Sacred Woods Temple in Damanhur, and I've led so many different groups with so many different activities. I've also done it in multiple parts around the world. And I love doing this more than anything because of the feedback I get. Like not feedback about me, feedback about the activities that we do and the dynamics and the connections. And then what comes back helps me put together the pieces. And one of the recurring themes that I hear from people all the time, I never mention it, but they all say it, is that the only way we fully see ourselves is when we both, plant as well as human, elevate beyond our physicalness and see each other almost like divine self to divine self, for lack of a better term. Like when we allow ourselves to step into that higher realm of myself, then I can see the fullness of not just myself, but the fullness of all the other beings around. With nature spirits, they're even farther away, right? Because their physical essence, they haven't found a physicality that works in our worlds still, where the plants have found this physical nature that's constrained, but still has a lot to offer. The nature spirits, it's more of a sensation still or a fleeting glance because I have not yet found a way to get to that subtleness of level, to tap into those outermost layers of my aura or my subtle body where they are more comfortable and where they can be more physically consistent. As a matter of fact, in Damanhur, in all of our territories, all of our homes and the lands that we have, there's no smoking allowed. It's the number one hard and fast rule. No smoking, neither do we smoke as initiates, but no smoking is allowed. And that's because the nature spirits told us, we made a pact with them many years ago, a pact that is renewed every Sunday. There is a ritual that happens every Sunday where we ask the nature spirits if they want to continue this pact with us, and we sign ourselves as well as them to the pact is all about co-creating together. And they say that smoke, it hurts their subtle body. It makes it more difficult for them to manifest in the physical. And so therefore it blows, which is interesting what we say to ourselves. I mean, anybody who's been on a spiritual path knows that if you drink too much or if you smoke too much, you blow holes in your aura is the way that I always heard it in other schools that I was in. And I'm like, oh, that makes sense because you are, messing with that subtle energy. And so therefore we don't allow any smoking on any of our territories because we're trying to create an environment that allows more and more of those nature spirits to densify in so that we can start to reunite these worlds.
Oh my gosh, I was just mesmerized by everything that you were just talking about just now because, it's so interesting, right? Because, for example, I think I heard someone say that plants are moving and they're
Mhm.
talking to one another, but we can't conceptualize, we can't see it, we can't, our senses aren't where they need to be for us to kind of see them like moving and talking and, interacting with one another and also interacting with us. So it's very interesting how you kind of really talked about in order to really see their full essence and perhaps they see our full essence, it would almost have to transcend our physicality.
Beautiful way of saying it.
Yeah, so it's just very fascinating. Then you talk about nature spirits, and of course, plants are a part of nature. And I
Mhm.
guess they've been able to manifest in the to this physical plane. And there are also other nature spirits that we can't see, or some people will say that they're just in a different dimension. They have a
Right.
physicality, perhaps, or a shape in a different dimension. And there are people who have been able to see nature spirits. What is Tinkerbell called in
Oh, a fairy.
yeah, they've been able to see like fairies and all these different cool beings, right? They've been able to like physically see them or so all of that is so interesting. But something else you talk about when it comes to connecting with plants, like really understanding that these are beings, right? With a consciousness. You talk about the fact that like we have to honor them in a way, right? They teach us about relationships because, for example, I think in a podcast I was listening to that you were on, you said that you have to ask the plant for permission of whether they want to interact with you. Or like when you're, when people say hug a tree, do you know if the tree wants a hug? So can you talk a little bit about that?
Exactly.
Like why that's important and why the average person like me, I don't think I can hear plants, but I love them. I love trees. So sometimes I do hug a tree. So yeah, can we just talk about why it's important to respect them in that way? And if for someone like me who loves plants and wants to hug a tree, how can I pick up on whether or not that's okay?
Yeah, and this is one of those things where I sometimes, I mean, we all have the right intentions, right? The intention is connection and all these aspects. And so I'm going to say two things that are really important about this. One, plants are not omnipotent, right? They're not all powerful beings that know everything. As a matter of fact, when you sit back and you start to understand why is it a plant knows certain things that I don't know, there's a few different elements that come up that I think are important for us to recognize. For example, one is that they just live a lot longer than we do and are much more interconnected. So sometimes I might be talking with one particular plant who gives me an answer, but that answer didn't come from that plant. That answer came from a different plant that had that knowledge that passed on. There's much more awareness of the overarching ecosystem and the interconnectivity as well as generationally. So there's just lots of ways that plants receive information. That being said, always important to remember, plants are not human. So a plant can tell you a plant experience and a plant can try. This is why plants oftentimes will tap into your memories. They're trying to get you to understand something through a lens that you can understand. And, so going to your question of I don't know whether I should hug this plant is sometimes just taking that second to stop and ask the question and then allowing the answer to come to you in whatever way it might come. You might have a memory of being, I'll give you an example of a no. What would to me be a no? I stand in front of a plant and I say, I want to hug you. And I get this remembrance of, I don't know, my friend's grandmother's aunt who would walk through the door and grab me and hug me. And I hated the way I felt. And that would be to me a no because it's, oh, thank you. So the plant maybe couldn't say the word no to me or didn't know how to say something. Or maybe they put a song in your head. All of a sudden you remember this song that's, oh my goodness, I hate when this song gets stuck in my head. Oh, that's a no. It could be anything that is about because the plant is going to pull in to whatever sensation you could feel. You might have a tickle that makes you laugh, and that's, oh, okay, that's a yes. It could be something that you could just slip and kind of or twist your, self a little bit, and you're like, oh, okay, that's a no. So it could come in so many different ways, is to open ourselves to the idea that if I think of myself that when I stand in front of a tree in this case, I am a multi-sensory being and the plant is a multi-sensory being, then let me allow the response to come in whatever sense that plant might be able to connect to me in, because we don't know each other. So we don't have a shared history, which is very different from, for example, the plants that live in my home, who I have a shared history with. So that plant might communicate in something that we have both lived through. Where instead, when I go into the woods or like walking down the street of my neighborhood, I might get sensations that are very generic, or that the plant, if I really give myself space and I sit there for a second and I ask the question and I say, I'm open, just give me the answer, the plant might be able to come in and find a memory of mine in order to explain that. So Plants are beings too, and they have their good days and they have their bad days. And some days, some kid's been running around over and over, running over their roots and stepping on them and doing this and feeling it. They might not want a hug, man. So you look human. I love you, but not right now, type of thing. And we've definitely heard that and seen that and see it all the time. So really, the biggest piece of how you start this relationship is about being present. I often say that one of the things that happens when you work really closely with plants is that you start to tap into your own inner plantness, right? Remember that unification of the worlds. My inner plantness. So as a being, as an animal, because I am an animal, right? As an animal, I have instinct and movement, right? That's like a big piece. Like action is through movement. Action is through taking things and moving with it and doing and also running away. Unfortunately, we run away way too much. We tap into that part of our animalness way too much. But what does a plant do? A plant has to be there. They have to be in it. They can't run away. They can move little things, but they can't run away from bad times. They can't run away from the annoying person who's, trying to chop at their leaves. They can't do anything. So what do they have to do? They have to learn how to be. They're present, and then they have to think long term. So when I tap into my plantness, I get to start experiencing that. And we've lost our presence as human beings. We've lost so much of our ability to just be. We think we always have to be doing. But when you start to really tap into that part of yourself, you start to recognize rest, taking time, being in it. I'm having an emotional difficulty rather than running away from it, which is what we mostly do, or like thinking about it, but from a distance. I now dump myself into it. I swim in it and I let it be a part of myself because I know that my animalness is going to show me the path towards where I'm going to go. But my plantness allows me to feel where that path really is. And that can start with as easy as sitting with one of the plants in your home, for example, and just being there. I am here with you. I am here for you. I am just here and letting whatever comes, whatever memories. It's not like meditation where you try to take away the memories that come. It's the opposite. Whatever comes into your mind, let it wash over you and be in it in that moment. And allow the plant to find ways to connect with you and for you to just be in whatever that might be.
I have a couple thoughts that are flowing into my stream of consciousness that I hope I can kind of say in a way that you're able to follow. So, when you first said that plants don't know everything, they're not omnipotent, that was the
Mhm.
word, correct?
Yep.
It made me think about certain things I've heard from Dolores Cannon. I don't know if you're familiar with her work. I think she was a past life regressionist, and she, I think, regressed thousands and thousands of people. And based on the information she got from those sessions, she put them into a book. Long story short, she talked about different levels of consciousness, of being, right? And how, you know, there's consciousness in a rock, there's consciousness in plants, and then human beings have their consciousness. And each level of consciousness or incarnation is higher than the next, right? And then I think about language in the Bible, and I might be oversimplifying the language, but it's this idea that human beings have dominion over the earth, right? So we kind of have the authority, right? God has
Ah,
made it
yeah.
that way that we can rule over the plants and we can rule over the animals. It's almost kind of like they're in service to us and we can kind of do
Oh yeah. The
whatever we
big the
want to
big
do.
misunderstanding and misinterpretation of biblical language. But please carry
Yeah,
on. No,
yeah.
it's true. It's
Yeah.
such a big thing for some people. I
Yeah.
totally understand.
Because, some people might be listening to this conversation. You have to ask the plants for permission. What are we talking about here? So just want to acknowledge those different perspectives. And I guess the reason I'm bringing all of that up in terms of like levels of consciousness and hierarchy of beingness, and then also like having dominion over the earth, I guess my question is, in terms of consciousness, ability to understand the world, when you interact with plants, and this might be a weird question, do you find that we are of a higher consciousness than they are?
It's a great. So remember I told you that this whole discussion about planchette consciousness started with Aristotle and Plato. So the different levels of consciousness is Aristotelian. So basically, this was Aristotle's belief system. His belief system was what is called the Scala Naturae, and it's the belief system that there are different levels of consciousness and that each level of consciousness builds upon the other, and that we as human beings are closest to the divine consciousness. So much so that they didn't use the word consciousness back then. The word was soul, which is, I think, fascinating that they equated consciousness to soul, where we today will talk about not having consciousness. They never said nobody didn't have consciousness, but there was vegetative consciousness, there was mineral consciousness, there was animal consciousness, and then there was human consciousness. And it was, in Aristotelian's belief, there was a scale. So, Davenhurian philosophy is really interesting on this because we also work very much with past lives. We work a lot with lives in general. We have an entire system also for ensuring our incarnation and moving through and staying connected from one life to the other, and a really elaborate understanding of the structure and the nature of the soul from the attractor all the way through to your personalities and such like this. And I once asked, our spiritual teacher who passed away about 10 years ago, we asked him, I was like, what is this about these layers, these levels? And he was like, so a big thing about Falco was the fact that he was living simultaneously, because time is another big concept in our community. And so time is all simultaneous. It's this river and this fabric of time more than a line of time. So very condensed way of saying it. But the point being is, like, his big thing was he was actively living 88 lives at the same time. And he said, when you start to live all these lives, you recognize that a big chunk of these lives are animal lives and a big chunk of them are plant lives. And each life is a consciousness, right? Obviously, but they're all still connected to the soul. So for you to believe that plants have a lesser means that you believe you yourself have lesser, because at some point my soul has incarnated as a plant. And so does that remove my own consciousness? Do I become stupid or something lesser when I'm incarnated as them? And it's honestly, it's not even useful. Like, it's not useful for what we want to create in the world. Even if it was true, let's just for a second pretend that it is. In my experience, of course, it's not, but let's just pretend. Is it useful to think about that? Is it useful for me to think that you're lesser? Even if you think about a person, is it useful for me to think that you're a lesser person than I am? I could definitely say you might be better in mathematics than I am, and I'm better in social studies, for example. I'm good at rhetorical analysis, and you haven't designed that. But is it because of a capability or just because you haven't developed that? So honestly, I don't want to put down anybody's belief systems, but I just think, is it really helping you get to where you want in your life by thinking and approaching a plant as a lesser being? Or is it much more interesting to think, wow, you are this being that has had an experience that I could not have, at least consciously right now. You know what it's like to be bound. You know how to adapt. You know how to be resilient. You know how to discard parts of yourself that are no longer useful. You know how to bring upon a pollinator to bring you into it. You know how to go from one type of environment to another. There's so many things we could learn. And so why not focus there? Why not move us into those types of directions? I feel like
Right.
that is just so much more useful than even the misinterpretation. I study under a wonderful researcher and scholar of Hebrew, ancient Hebrew text. He's a translator, he's a Kabbalist. I love studying under him from the perspective of how much he's gone back to redefine and to re-translate words. And there are so many mistranslations. And dominion is a great example. If you've heard me, you'll hear me call, instead of the kingdom, I call it the kin home, because kin as in, the fact that we're all kin, and which is also a recommended pronoun by Robin Wall Kimmerer for beings of nature, kin and ki. So singular and plural instead of him, her, or it, which is horrible. And the idea of, why would I go for dominion, which wasn't even the case? Dominion was not intended ever to be, I dominate you. Dominion was meant more from the perspective of a space, right? An area in which it is. And so it's, you know what, screw it. Again, it's not useful. It's not useful. I'm going to kin home. Like it's the home of kin. So it's the plant kin home, it's the animal kin home, it's the fungi kin home. I'm just going to go. We had this big discussion in the naturally conscious community about this, and we went through all the old translations, and we were just like, there are so many mistranslations here. Forget it. We're just going with kin home.
I like that because words do hold a lot of power. They hold a frequency. And some people will say with words and spelling, everything is intentional. And you have to be, I don't want to say be careful because we can't overthink everything that we're saying, but there's a hidden meaning and resonance behind certain words that are becoming outdated or, like you said, misinterpreted, or there were misinterpretations from the past, and we have to
Right.
kind of do a better job as we become more enlightened to make sure that we're using the right words, right, with the right definitions. But there's something
And
you
with
said.
the, and I'm just going to add one little piece to that, which is super important is, and the right current definition in the sense that at the time when the amount of words was less, when everybody had a very shared definition, that word might have been okay. Just the same as we were talking about soul. At that time, science was calling it a soul rather than calling it consciousness because there wasn't the religion that exists today. There wasn't all these other things. And so science has had to separate out into consciousness instead of using soul, not because there's anything wrong with soul, but because soul has a different interpretation to a Christian or to, a Muslim or to a pagan. And so, like you said, the words matter because we have to try to put the words together that do not limit. Oftentimes, our words limit our ability to understand something rather than giving expansion and space to it.
Absolutely, absolutely. So there's something that you said that I think also kind of adds another dimension to the question that I asked you, which I think is important to ask because, for example, you talked about the fact that plants know how to discard things that are no longer working for them and they have their whole system of, well-being. So in people having conversation about consciousness, right? Why they would make the argument for, oh, human beings have a higher consciousness is because the more conscious we get, the more we raise our vibration, the more we evolve, right? There's
Correct.
some sort of spiritual evolution happening, right? The thought process is that, of course, like when we look at plants, they look almost static. They're not moving. When we think about consciousness and not just plants, but even with animals that move and stuff who we can't talk to or communicate with and quote unquote, we're more intelligent than people could make the argument that like what separates us from their consciousness is the fact that we can evolve and we can raise our vibration. Is that possible in the plant kingdom as well? Sorry, we just had a whole conversation about that.
It's all
Is
good.
is that possible in the plant kin home as well?
Totally. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, if you think about it, plants have been evolving way longer than we as human beings have. So again, we try to define everything. It's kind of like the the human neurobiologist or the animal neurobiologist that define consciousness through brain, right? So the idea is that if you have a brain, then that means that you're conscious. But again, going back to Aristotle and Plato, who were talking about plants having consciousness, even from the very beginning of time. So what, did they lose their consciousness somewhere along the lines because they don't have brains? So we have to be very careful as to not defining spiritual aspects through physiological means. And I think that this is probably because if you really look at who is the more evolved beings, human beings have been, Homo sapiens in particular, have been on the planet for about 200,000 years. That's, some will say a little bit more, some will say a little bit less. Okay. Plants have been on this planet for 470 plus million years. Okay. 470 plus million years. They have had to deal with extinction events. They've had to deal with scarcity. They've had to deal with abundance. They've had to switch the atmosphere to something that is usable. They are pioneer species, or the species that take barren ground that has nothing and convert it into something that is lush and perfect. And well, who's more evolved? If you think about that in reference to humans, if we don't have water, we die. Plants kind of have designed, like a whole series of plants have said, oh, no water? No big deal. I'm just going to shrivel up and wait for hundreds of years until it rains, and then I'll come back to life. We can't do that. Like plants have learned how to take 3/4 of their body gets cut off, no problem. I'm just going to remove all the energy from that and I'm just going to grow in this direction. Oh, you mean now I am a tropical plant that has been put into winter conditions? No problem. Give me about 4 generations and I will learn how to live in the snow. Like we as humans don't do that. And we try to think, oh, we're more evolved and we do all these things. Actually, besides the fact of plants in general, which if you leave a space, who will conquer it? Microbes, plants, fungi, like they're the ones there. But some of the most evolved super organisms in the planet are actually ants. Ants build everything. They build structures, they build hotels, they do surgery on one another. They have, all kinds of different civic roles. Like we have to stop looking at definitions based on our human achievements, which are great. Don't get me wrong. I do think that we have humans, we have some limitations, but we have evolved a lot of things. But wow, how much more would we evolved if we co-created with plants? And that really is, I think, the heart of the argument is I have lost my presence. I have lost part of my senses as a human being. I have lost connections and relationships as a human being because my society, which looks abundant because it's the only thing I know, plants could be having the same conversation about us. What are they doing? What a waste of energy and space. And oh my goodness, if they keep doing that, they're just going to kill themselves. So, like we don't have to worry about any of that type of stuff. How do I plants migrate when, the weather gets to be too extreme? They migrate farther higher elevations north. There's just so many different aspects that plants do differently and things that plants have not limited themselves in. Going to our evolution is if we believe that we on this planet, even from a spiritual perspective or even from a physiological only perspective, are here to evolve and to continue to grow and learn, is it better for my evolution to think I'm already at the top? Or is it better for my evolution to think that I'm actually in the middle of other beings and that I can continue to learn from? People often ask me why it is that I stayed in Damanhur when I came here 15 years ago. By this point, I was already teaching around the world. I had been, like I said, a part of different spiritual paths. I was teaching spiritual paths. I had come out of the corporate life. I was living a dream life. I had been on tour with Cirque du Soleil. I had done so many things already, and I loved where I was living. I was not one of those people that showed up in this community because I was lost. I was thriving. And people say, well, then why did you stay in the middle of the mountains? Because we're in the middle of the mountains, at the foothills of the Alps, and, stay in this community. And I said, because how delicious to be a student again, to be in a society that has so many different levels where one of the high priestesses could be, somebody that cleans the bathroom and so shows that cleaning the bathroom is a noble and wonderful profession, and somebody who instead could be, doing this alchemical massive operation on one side and on the other side, I don't know, cooking for a whole household full of it was so amazing to finally be in a place where all these different quote unquote levels mixed and where I could be sure, I didn't lose anything of my intelligence or the knowledge I had or the everything I had experienced, but it was also in a context where at some points I was just a novice and I have thrived and grown and continue to expand because in some places I'm up here and in other places I'm down there and in some places we're in the sides and maybe I'm looking at it from this way and I have all those different ways. So again, why put myself at the top?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm so happy I asked you that question because it's also illuminated my mind. And I think the listeners listening to it is, like, I've never thought about it that way. We're talking about consciousness and we're talking about the spiritual part of human life and plant life, right? And something that I'm learning more and more as I have these conversations is that for a while, right, I used to think, oh, when people are talking about connecting with angels and the other side, it's only love and, beautiful things that come from there. And I soon found out, maybe that was naive, that, yeah, there are some spirits and beings on the other side that they don't have this motivation for the highest good. And they're more on the path of, inciting violence and the more destructive parts of life. Now, people always say don't judge, but for the sake of the conversation, have to make a I have to distinguish that so I can ask my question. So, in your experience in working with plants, are there plants that are what people might interpret as they don't come from a place of love and they have like intentions that are not as good, if that makes any sense, if you
It
understand what
makes
I'm trying to
perfect sense.
ask?
Oh, totally. We call it here in Dominer the anti-life principle. It's the principle that wants to hold life back. We don't see it so much as like purposely being destructful, like in the sense that having that, I hate you and I want to destroy it, but more of I need everything to stay the same. And stagnant in the end is the same as destruction because it's the anti-life. It's what holds everything back into place. And most of the time that comes from fear. We were just, it's funny, I do a plant inspired masterclass on the second Tuesday of every month as part of the Blooming Sprouts program in my community, in the naturally conscious community. And we do these really in-depth discussions that are inspired, take exactly the type of question you just asked and kind of look at it through the lens of plant intelligence and plants, the way a plant would approach it, and also what a plant wouldn't do. And we just had that conversation, which is so it's really great that you asked it because we were talking about, obviously, for those people that are in the United States at the time that we're recording this, it's pretty rough out there. Let's just use it that way. It doesn't matter what your political affiliation. We're just going to go with rough. Like it's a rough time. And in that roughness, we were having that conversation of what plant principles can really help us and how can plant communicating with plants help us better understand this. And we started to get into this conversation around what we think of as invasive species, which are not necessarily the same thing as non-natives, although many are non-natives. But invasive species, for example, in particular parasitic, we got into a big conversation between mistletoe and kudzu, and which are two, or moonflower, that was the other one, that are all kind of parasitic plants to a certain extent. So they're plants that need a host of some sort in order to do that. And we had this really interesting conversation about the fact that, of course, when I look at these types of parasitic plants, especially if they're in the wrong environment, they take over and it appears that they are killing everything else off. Right. We talked about blackberry. That was another one. We got into a massive conversation about blackberry because blackberry bushes, delicious, right? I make blackberries. I can make blackberry jam. I have all these things. But a blackberry bush that grows out of control becomes really huge with humongous thorns and will like basically take over an area and kill off inadvertently everything else that's there. And what we got to, our conversation is still ongoing because this is not an easy question. It's not let me give you a 3-second soundbite. It's impossible. But what we were getting to and what we were realizing in our conversation was how much, first of all, the concept of life and death is a big concept in order to get to a good answer. And I say this because in human terms, we tend to think of life good, death bad, period. We have these kind of big black and white extremes. And it's not that cut and dry when you look at it from a plant perspective. A plant might sacrifice their life in order to, because I've given my seeds and I'm migrating into a new area. So I'm going to kill myself off in this area because I know my seeds are going to take. And so therefore I am slowly moving my entire species up the mountain or to better, something like ginkgo has traveled the entire world doing this, looking for those right conditions. So one concept that makes this type of conversation really hard is the life-death conversation. Because if humans allowed ourselves in more cultures, because it's more of a cultural norm, to explore life, death, to bring even those of us that believe in an afterlife, bring those conversations deeper into everyday living. Falco used to say that, in order to live well, I have to have planned for a good death. And because when I can get away from the fear of death, and death can be at every level, right? Physical body, death of death of a relationship, death of a part of my body. Like it could be in so many different levels. But when I stop being afraid of death and I start to see that as just a transition through another thing, many of the other fears that trigger the conversation that we were just, your question start to take on a different light. So do we have anti-death, anti-life principles? Absolutely. And they happen all over the universe from a subtle level and divine level all the way through to plants and animals and all kinds of different aspects. I'm not going to lie, it exists, right? And the anti-life is where the principle of fear has taken over so far that I want to just stay stuck in the status quo because anything outside of my status quo is too frightening for me to deal with. I'm afraid that if I move over here, I'm going to lose the money that I need. And if I lose the money, I'm not going to be able to buy my food and I'm not going to be able, why? Because I don't know how to forage. I don't know how to survive. I don't know how to build a shelter. I don't know how to deal with the elements. I don't know how to do anything of that. I can't do this over here because I don't know how to be alone. I don't know how to move in this way. I don't know how to do, and so I think what saves, quote unquote, what makes it a little bit easier for plants is that the life death principle is not as strong, is not as extreme. So the solution for a plant who can't deal with a lot of these things is I'm going to try to take over, right? So moonflower and kudzu, I'm going to be an invasive and I'm going to take over, but you can always pull me out and kill me too. And so that changes the relationship slightly, even though the behavior is still there. And it makes it, I think, a little bit easier for us from the outside to understand the relationship when we give ourselves space and time. I was just on a call at the beginning of the week for where it's this call that happens, which is beautiful in critical plant studies, where an author explains their paper, and their paper was all about kudzu. And it was just really put a lot of these different pieces into perspective. It's a long-winded answer to explain the fact that, do I believe that these types of behaviors exist? Yes. Do I believe that some of their origins are similar to the origins that we have in humans? Absolutely. Like, I am in a species, I've been put into a new spot. I do not know how to survive in this spot. So what do? I kill off things around me because I don't know how to survive. Once that plant adapts and is able to, then even a parasitic plant finds, like mistletoe is a great example, a checks and balance. Okay, I'm going to kill off this branch slightly, but that's going to keep this tree from getting too big and creating problems in this overall ecosystem. So now we're actually partners, even though in my own little way, I'm living off of you. So it goes back to what I was talking about relationships, where we think of relationships as like a parasite. We've given it a bad word. It's a negative. Anything that's a parasite is bad. But in nature, parasites can be really great because they are the equivalent of checks and balance. They are the ones that allow things. But when that parasitic plant ends up in the wrong environment, now all of a sudden that checks and balance goes out. And so they cause more harm than good. And in that aspect, they go into what you were just saying.
I like how you broke everything down and the analogy that you gave with our world as human beings. And it's kind of the same principle where we think, okay, something bad is happening. This is the worst thing. But sometimes the bad thing serves for our greater good. And there's that relationship of balance there, but also being cognizant of the fact that, yeah, these things are not ideal. And like you said, in the plant world, it's anti-life. So very fascinating. Have you ever communicated with some of these parasitic plants? Are you able to? And
Yeah,
what was that
absolutely.
like?
Absolutely. And I have one of my student clients. I love her. She has this really interesting relationship with Moonflower because I'm always pulling Moonflower out because Moonflower tries to take over in her house. And part of that is, again, we see this conversation in fire suppression, right? And the whole idea that part of the reason why we're having so many problems with fires across the globe is because we have, as human beings, have labeled ourselves as anti-nature, which is really stupid. And that means that we've taken ourselves out. We don't trust ourselves anymore to be useful to nature. So we've taken ourselves out of the cycle of life. And so therefore, the roles that we as human beings used to take in a connected, co-creative way, like fire, in order to keep certain areas healthy, we've lost our place. Right. So what is happening? Other species are coming in, other experiences are coming in that to us are destructive because they threaten the way that we want to live. But to the natural perspective is, I'm just trying to recreate a balance, right? And so you have stopped doing your role in fire suppression. So therefore, some other force needs to come in, and that force is in a different way. And so parasitic plants is a great example of something like that, where, when you have that conversation, you really do see things through different eyes. One of the things I really love about working with the plants is, like I said, that presence. You mentioned it before, where you were saying how sometimes we have these bad things that happen, but it's for our greater good. And I think, I don't know about anybody else, but for me, one of my biggest challenges in life is understanding that tipping point. Like, when is this thing that's happening to me actually feel horrible and feel like I should fight it with everything in my body? And yet there's a part of me that knows, let it happen. It's better, right? When do I fight and when do I adapt and release and let myself into it? And I think that this is such a hard thing because of that disconnection from our inner plantness that I was talking about, that disconnection between these worlds, even within ourselves, that without presence, you don't have that voice inside of you for, let's just call it a voice, but that intuition, that connection, whatever it is that thing, that knowing, that embodiment of knowing, to know, okay, this really sucks, but just sit here in it and just sit, let it go, let it all burn around you. I had a student of mine who just lost her house at the beginning of the year in the Los Angeles fires. And we were talking about it, and she's still processing, obviously, because some of the things that happened relating to the losing of the house, she takes responsibility for some aspects that have happened that could have been much better, but she didn't listen to herself. And she's like, this whole thing, as horrible as it seems, and she loved this house, she raised her kids in this house. It's not about the house, but she's like, it's not about the house. I really learned how much I'm not listening to myself. I never gave myself the chance to hear what I was supposed to do in this fire, like how I was supposed to relate to the fire, what I was supposed to do for my house, for my family, for things. I didn't listen to any of it. I just went, hey, it'll be fine. And is it horrible? Do we wish the lesson would have come a different way? Sure. But this is how it came. And what's making me realize is that doesn't mean, she should have stayed and fought or anything like that. But the point being is, I just didn't connect in. I didn't give myself that space to listen. And so I think that's one of the things that, parasitic plants really help me to understand is, when is the parasite being useful? I don't know. I often use the example in a human terms of, let's just assume that I'm somebody who has, a fair amount of money. I'm super comfortable. And my next door neighbor has a child. My next door neighbor is like this young person who doesn't have the money for school. And I just choose to take care of this person for the next 3 or 4 years. Complete parasite, right? That person is being a parasite on me. They are eating off of me. I'm paying for their school. I'm doing anything. I'm not expecting anything in return. On the contrary, my savings is dwindling, right? So people would say, oh my God, he's a mooch. Could be. But if this relationship instead is going to create a human being that is going to be more successful in society and life, even if I don't get a personal direct benefit from it, that's might be totally fine. And so parasites, when talking to these type of parasitic plants, helped me really put in perspective of, again, how do I evaluate when the parasite is gone over too far, and when instead is this something that maybe it doesn't affect me, and it's maybe better for the overall ecosystem and makes the ecosystem better. And that's enough.
How do you feel about psychedelics?
Yeah, so I don't care for them personally, in the
Okay.
sense that it's really funny too, because I used to produce really large dance parties and I never took anything. Like I never even smoked pot. And people look at me and they're like, what? I have sat in ayahuasca ceremonies and I have never drank. And people are like, what? And it's not out of a judgment thing. Although I probably at the very beginning it was. I did grow up in the dare period, where it's say no to drugs. But it just doesn't call to me. I used to say when I produced events that the music was my psychedelic, and I loved when I would literally produce them myself when they were my parties, because I could create myself a little space where I could dance with nobody bothering me, because it was my party and I could see like wall off this little area and be like, nobody comes in here because this is where I dance, type of thing. And today it's everything else that I do that also has that same piece. Yeah, I've never felt the need for it. I have sat in ceremony several times and I've held space, and for me it's probably because I am a partnership type of person. I'm a co-collaborator person. And so I have no real, again, this isn't a judgment thing. Like I have no qualms with people who, as a matter of fact, what was that? Episode 97, I think it was, of my podcast has this amazing, it's called From Army Warrior to Plant Witch. And he's somebody who works very closely with ayahuasca. And we had this fascinating conversation because I'm like, if I ever took ayahuasca, that would be the way I would want to take it. But I like the co-creative perspective. And so therefore, if I'm not going to have a long-term relationship with a particular plant, it doesn't make sense for my personality to have this like one plant immersion type of thing into it. For that, the arts is much more powerful for me. An art exhibit, a dance party, a specific song. For me, it gets me. I know it sounds for some people, they're like, you just don't understand. Probably, but it's enough for me. I don't feel the need for it. I do tell people who do it to kind of just remember that this is about letting a plant in this particular case connected to other things to or whatever a being because it's fungi, it doesn't matter what it is, to take you on a journey and just remember to come back from it. That's what I say. I'm like, take whatever journey you need to do, just remember to come back and try to bring as much as you can into where you are today. Just come back.
I resonate with everything you said because at this stage in my life, because, I could have a different perspective in the future. But at this stage in my life, I don't feel called to do any sort of psychedelic plant-based drug. And I have no judgment either for people who do it. I've had someone on my podcast. I've had a couple people that I've talked to who have done some sort of plant-based, taking some sort of plant-based medicine. And it's fascinating to hear their experience. But for me, I think I don't have a connection with plants the way you do, but I feel like whatever journey that I need to take will be downloaded and it will happen irrespective of,
Yep.
partaking in that. And I had a dream one time where it kind of was sort of a simulation of how I would feel on like DMT, I think, or mushrooms. And I was like freaking out because I was losing my sense of self. And I was like, I don't like that feeling. Like not losing my sense of self, but like losing my grasp on reality. It was just like it was like so trippy. But yeah, anyways, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. And this is just scratching the surface, but I'm so happy that you were able to go on this ride with me and answer all my questions in such a very thoughtful way. And I can't wait to even go back and listen to this episode. I have to ask you, have you shifted in perspective on anything recently? I always ask this question to all of my guests because I feel like we're always shifting. And I just want to know if there's something in your life that you've kind of shifted your perspective on.
Yeah, I have actually. And I'm also somebody who's like constantly pushing the envelope of who I am, what I believe. I went from being a very closed off, sort of negative, like absolutist type of person to now really seeing the personalities. I'm going to tell you one that I'm working on right now. I just had this conversation yesterday. I am working on anger. Let me explain though. I am not working on getting rid of anger. I am working on finding anger. And this has been a big shift. So I was somebody that worked really hard to get rid of anger and judgment. And that's a whole story in and of itself, and everything that I have discovered along the way about my dominant personality of being a critic and all these things. And that led me to a really super beautiful, and I have some people will have told me that I have an overinflated sense of empathy. I'm very compassionate. Like I really can almost step into almost anybody's shoes. Like I love being able to like see things from your point of view and then, have that inform me. But in doing that, I have lost my ability to use righteous indignation and like constructive anger because I had labeled it bad, which we often do, because anger can be destructive. And last year, I worked a lot on shifting the idea of being critical to having a range from positive to negative. In other words, not assuming that just because I'm critical and I can break things down in some ways or even judge things as always bad, but that had a place and lots of experimentation and playing with it and understanding my personalities and really seeing it and being like, whoa, and feeling like I reached a new level of myself. And now in this year, I've realized that this lack of anger, I don't want to say it makes me a pushover because I'm kind of not a pushover, but I do realize that it's also not serving. Like it served me because I was using it, I was relying on it too much. But now in not having it, it means that I feel like I'm not as effective. And I'm realizing how I watch sometimes somebody who reams somebody who like tells them off in a way, but that's so helpful because sometimes somebody else just needs to get like anger in their face, but not judgmenty, like you're a jerk kind of, but more, that kind of intense anger that has its purpose that makes you say, oh my goodness, I really did go over a line, or I really did whatever. It shifts something in you differently than a conversation can. That's not to say that you shouldn't use conversations, but there are moments that anger strategically used can be extremely effective. And one of the shifts is that I have realized that I don't know how to do that anymore. And I am learning, I am working on finding anger,
That is
useful anger.
incredible. That is incredible. You just like, wow. Because usually it's the other way around, right? Where people are like, I'm
Mm,
just releasing anger, I'm working to release it. And it kind of reminds me of a conversation I had yesterday or 2 days ago with another podcast guest where we're talking about compassion, which the ability to hold mercy and justice at
mm,
the same time. And I think sometimes people veer so much into compassion that there's no level of accountability. Not saying that that's where you
that's
are.
me.
Oh, okay, okay,
That's
yeah,
me. I
yeah,
can do that.
yeah.
I not hold people accountable the way I should hold them accountable for exactly that reason. And that's a very Kabbalistic way of saying it because it is true. Like compassion, justice, and mercy held together in balance, which is Gabuddha, and it really is that compassion piece. And I grew up identifying with Gabuddha, the more justice. I was very much my mother thought I was going to be a lawyer, and I was like all about a justice fighter. And then I went to this compassion side, and I have sat there because it helped me be honestly less of a bitch, to be honest. And then I lost it. So you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm the first example of I can point out the accountability necessary, but I can't hold you to it because I lost that anger part.
So bringing yourself back into balance.
Yep.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. Where can people find you? I know that you spoke about your website earlier in the episode, but could you repeat it? Where can
Yeah.
people find you if they want to work with you, learn more about you, all that good stuff?
Yeah, the easiest place to find me is, of course, my website. And having an unusual name, Tigrilla Gardenia, makes it a little bit easier. And pretty much that's my handle on everything. So tigrillagardenia.com, on Instagram, on YouTube, on Facebook. And also, and there's you'll find my podcast, you'll find my community, the Naturally Conscious community, as well as, how to work with me one-on-one and how to also work with me as part of one of my group programs.
Thank you again for stopping by the show. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you. Your questions were awesome. I love doing these interviews because it really keeps, also, like you said, we both learn from each other. And I'm left with a lot of things to think about myself.
That's amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.